It's apple season in Minnesota, so it's time to make some pie. Well, here we are. We have picked some Minnesota apples and we are ready to make a pie. The first thing you want to do, of course, is sanitize your work area. What I have in your sanitizers that are in the classroom is a gallon of water to a teaspoon of chlorine bleach. That is enough to kill off the bacteria off the table. Now, I'm not talking viruses, I'm talking bacteria, and that's what we're going to clean off in your work area, and then you can begin to work. You always want to do that every lab. The next thing we do is we take our apples, and we have two different types of apples here. The Golden Delicious that I picked from my tree, and then I have a softer apple, which I think is a State Fair apple, from the apple orchard. The reason that I want two different types of apples is the golden one is going to hold its shape, and the other one, I want a soft apple and a crisp apple. The crisp apple will hold its shape, and the soft apple will soften up like applesauce and fill in the gaps. So you have a nice pie when you're going to do it. Now you only need a half of each of the apple. So we're going to take our paring knife and cut the apple in half and save the other half, maybe for another person. If you're in class, then I'll give you a half of each of the apples and then you will work with a half of an apple. The next thing you're going to do is quarter the apple. And then you remove the seed bed, the core. And then you are going to take the apple and you're going to peel the outer peeling off. Now you could, for some apples, you can leave the peeling on and they kind of disintegrate as you bake them. But I don't like to have the peeling in an apple pie, so I peel it off. To use the paring knife, I want you to use the paring knife by slicing thin slices. You see how I'm holding my paring knife is in my grasp like this with the four fingers, and I'm pulling the sharp blade toward my thumb. It is safe to use the knife this way. This is a sharp knife, but I have more control over it by doing it this way. So one of the skills in this class that I want you to accomplish is using the paring knife. Now I'm dropping the apples into my sugar, which I should also have a little bit of cinnamon in there. I want a little bit of cinnamon and sugar on my apples. I want to drop them right into my cinnamon and sugar mixture. Just a little bit, however much cinnamon you want. You don't want to add too much or it gets a bad flavor in it. So I'm mixing a little sugar and cinnamon. What I have are 4 tablespoons of sugar and just enough cinnamon to give it a good color. And the sugar will keep the apples from turning brown as I slice them. So I will do the other piece of my 1/4 of the apple, peeling off the apple skin. And if you wanted to, if you were at home, you could save those apple skins and eat them. You could boil them up and make it smell good in the house, whatever you want to do. And then you are going to slice the rest of this apple. Again, pulling the knife toward your fingers as you are slicing. This apple is softer, it's easier to slice. And so slicing it into my sugar and cinnamon mixture. Now, if you were doing a lot of apples, there is a hand crank apple slicer that would save you a lot of time. But when we're just doing one little individual pie, and I want you to learn the paring knife skills, we are just going to slice it by hand. Now my apples are ready for the pie. I'm going to stir my apples in my cinnamon and sugar mixture to cover each apple to make sure that they don't turn brown. Get that sugar all coating all of the apples. It will start to break down a little bit and you'll form a liquid. And so we'll just set them aside. The next thing you're going to do is have some flour. Now the recipe calls for sifted flour. I'm going to take some flour out of my canister. This of course isn't a sifter, but to eliminate a lot of equipment in the kitchen, I like to have some novelty equipment. So I don't need to have the old-fashioned sifter. All I need is my strainer and sift my flour just by tapping the side. This will get it a fine flour mixture, and the lumps will be left in the strainer, and I can just have my sifted flour. Now that I have sifted flour, I want to carefully mix it into my bowl. There are two different types of pastry blenders you have. You have the loop pastry blender that looks like this. I used to use a pastry fork. That's what I learned to mix a pie with. But in the classroom, we have the loop pastry blenders. There's two different kinds in the classroom. One is a little bit more heavy duty than the other. And I like the wire one because you can clean it off as you are mixing it. Now before I do that, I'm going to preheat my oven to 425 so that it is ready to go. Anything that bakes for under an hour, the oven needs to be preheated. Okay, so what we need to have, we need our third cup. The recipe calls for 2/3 cup of flour. So what you want to do is gently scoop in your flour. You do not want to pack your flour, as we'll see when I demonstrate that with the biscuits. You want to have just your flour. Pastries, when you are making pastry, you want to follow some measurements. Now, I know there's some people that say, oh, my mom never measures. Well, some things you have to measure, and sometimes you measure the first time you make a recipe so you know how it turns out, and then you decide if you want to have a little bit more or a little bit less of something. So your recipe calls for 2/3 cup flour. I measured with 1/3 cup twice. And I can put that aside. The next thing it says is a 1/4 teaspoon salt. So I'll measure with a 1/4 teaspoon into the container. Salt is for flavor. That's why we are adding it. In the pastry, we only are adding the salt for flavor. If you wanted to leave it out, you could. The next thing we're going to do is measure our shortening. The reason it is called shortening is it shortens the gluten strands. So gluten is in flour. It makes it tough enough to hold a bread structure. But when we are making pastry, we want it delicate and tender. So we add the shortening, and it will be incorporated into the flour and therefore shorten the gluten strands, making your pastry dough very tender and flaky. That is the term we want to use with a nicely done pastry crust, is flaky. So we cover that, and then you're going to work in your shortening into your flour. You want to make sure that all of the shortening and the flour are incorporated. You should have it look like cornmeal when you have everything all incorporated. It's not cookie dough, so you don't want it to be put together like cookie dough. You want it to be like cornmeal. Very fine. That means we know we're going to have some nice layers of fat between the flour. Okay. I have my flour all covered, and I have this loosely all kind of gathered together. So the next thing I'm going to do is add my cold water. Now I put an ice cube in my water to make sure it was very cold, because when you're doing a pastry, you want very cold water. So I'm going to sprinkle it on. There's 1 tablespoon. I'll toss that around with my pastry blender. And then I want a half a tablespoon, which of course is 1.5 teaspoons, or estimate on your spoon, just so that that water absorbs into the flour. Now, one of the things when you are making pastry, flour can have a lot of different consistencies because of the moistness or the dryness in the air. And so, again, we use a measurement to get an idea of what we want to do, and then we have to kind of get a feel for it as far as if we have enough moisture or if it's too dry yet, and then we have to add a little bit more water. So as you form it, I'm not squeezing it through my fingers. I am pulling it up into a ball and just kind of pressing it together so it holds its shape. Now again, like I said, you don't squeeze it through your fingers. I'm just holding it and forming the ball. And it should have a texture similar to Play-Doh at this time in the palm of your hand. But we aren't going to squeeze it and manipulate it like Play-Doh because that would make your crust tough. One of the things, sometimes you can use lard instead of the vegetable shortening, and that makes a nice crust. Lard is, of course, from the hog fat that you have to render and cool, and then you have your nice lard for a pie crust. It is one of the best things to use for a pie crust. Now I'm dividing up my dough into 2 pieces because I want a top crust and a bottom crust. And you want to work, you don't want this to dry out. So once you are ready to work, you want to get going on your pie crust. I have my work surface ready, but I need to have it lightly floured. Now when it's your first time, go ahead and use a little bit more flour, because what you want to do is get the pie crust to get off of the table or the countertop where you are working. And so if it takes a little bit more pie flour for the first time that you do something, you can do that. I like to flatten mine into a pancake shape. Again, gently doing it. You want to try to only roll your pie crust once. Otherwise, the second roll, it'll be a little bit on the dry side. Now taking your rolling pin, put some flour on your rolling pin, and you crisscross your rolling pin to roll out your pie crust. If it seems like it's sticking a little bit, you get the flour up on there. You don't wait for it to stick and pull up on your rolling pin. Again, I'm crisscrossing so it rolls it in 2 different directions and gets it to the size. I want it larger than my pie pan, about 1 inch larger. That looks pretty good. So the next thing I'm going to do is take my pie crust and roll it up onto the rolling pin. I like to use a food scraper, which are in your kitchens, or you can use a turning spatula that you might have at home if you don't have something else to bring it up. Okay, so now I've rolled it into my pie tin. I want to gently set it down into the pie plate. I don't want to press it in there because that would stretch the dough and that would cause shrinkage. Not such a big deal when you have an apple pie filling, but if you were making a single crust pie, it would, as you would bake it, it would shrink and you'd have a goofy looking pie crust. Still edible, but not as nice looking as you want to have it. If you were doing a pumpkin pie, you would do a single crust like this, do the fluted edge that I'm going to demonstrate later, and you would put your pie filling in there. So I'm going to take the scissors and cut just a little bit beyond the edge of my plate. And I'll save that pie dough in case, and put it along with my upper crust. And now I'm ready for my apples. I'm going to set it off to the side here. because I still have to roll my upper crust in this area. My apples look like they formed a nice liquid, broken down the sugar. So now I can layer my apples into my pie crust. It's a small pie crust, so we want to not just dump the apples, we want them to all be in there. And so we're going to layer them in like this. Okay, there's the apple layered from my 2 pie apples that I cut. I have a little bit of sugar syrup left in here, so I want to dump that on there so it tastes good. Okay, and now I am ready for my next crust. If you're starting, use plenty of flour so that it rolls out nice. I'm going to flatten my crust, top crust. Clean off my rolling pin from the first rolling, reflour it from the grease that is on there. Crisscross my rolling so I get a nice circle. Check my pie plate. And I probably want it just a little bit bigger. Now you have a nice circle. Perfect. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do is put a little bit of butter onto the pie. This helps keep it from boiling over. I'm still going to put a pan underneath my apple pie. I don't have such good luck with apple pies not boiling over. So I like to have a little bit of butter under the crust, but I will still put a pan underneath that. The next thing I need to do on my pie crust is take the water and gently tap around my pie with a little bit of water. This is like pastry glue. The water will help hold the crust, the top crust, so that the pie filling doesn't leak in between, or kind of help hold that in there. Again, using the food scraper. Ready to set it down on my pie. And then I seal the edges. I will cut off a little bit around the edge, not too much. I want to flute the edges. So I want to have a little bit overhang. And then what I like to do is kind of roll the 2 crusts together by pinching them and tucking. And then I will flute the edges. So tucking the pie up like this. Pinching it, you can kind of feel when it pinches together. Again, it's like working with Play-Doh, only a little bit more tender. You'll then take the edges, so it looks like this. Now I'm going to flute the edges by taking 1 finger and 2 fingers and just kind of pinching together like this, going around the edge. Trying to keep the dough even around your finger, and it will look like this. Now at this time I might take a little bit of milk and cinnamon and sugar and sprinkle it on there. because I like to have that flavor on my crust. But the main thing I need to do is to have some air vents. And so my grandma taught me, or my grandma and my mom taught me how to make a pie. And there was a technique that they used with a flower or sort of a leaf pattern. And so that is the pattern that I like to use when I am making my pie. And then I put a few air vents around here. And your pie is ready to go in the oven. Like I said, I like to put a little pan underneath it, and then your pie will bake until it is golden brown, and then it is ready to be taken out of the oven. So that is the method to do the pie. We'll put the pie in the oven, and I'm going to set 20 minutes just so I can keep an eye on things. And there you have it. So enjoy making your pie.